Hi, this is George Gruhn at Gruhn Guitars. We have lots of questions sent in by our fans, so I'll plow right in. We have a question, Phil Munzio in Connecticut. After I'm gone, I'd like my small guitar collection to end up in the hands of avid young players who will use and appreciate these high quality electric and acoustic guitars. What provisions in my will would you recommend to ensure that this happens? Well, basically, this is not going to happen unless you have a good executor, because you're going to have to either leave them to an institution that will do this, or appoint an executor who will take care of that. Obviously, if you wanted to just contribute money to charity, an executor could handle a sale of the instruments and the money could go to an educational institution or something of the sort. But so far as guaranteeing that these instruments will end up in the hands of players, or they can be gifted to players, they could be loaned to players, they could stay with a school that might use those as loaner instruments for concerts. For example, Belmont University has a guitar museum, and one of my good customers died, and I helped him write his will, and it provided for helping to set up a museum. And it was my job to find an institution that would do that, and Belmont University here in Nashville took that on, and that is another possibility. But there's no one simple solution, but it certainly involves having to have a good executor to do this, a well thought out plan followed up with a good executor. John Astill in North Carolina, what is your opinion of wild grain East Indian rosewood regarding tonal quality and structural quality versus traditional straight grain? Well, I can tell you that prior to World War II, Martin, for their style 45 guitars, their highest grade instruments, always sought to get good quarter sawn, straight grained Brazilian rosewood rather than wildly figured. And wildly figured often enough means slab cut rather than quarter cut, and that is not as structurally stable. So far as tonal quality, wild grain does not necessarily enhance great tonal quality. In spruce, makers typically are looking for very straight grained quarter cut spruce, and good quarter cut rosewood is also very fine for structural stability as well as great sound. Much of the time, wild grain means something else. Rosewood and maple can be slab cut and still be quite usable. Whereas, for example, slab cut spruce would be totally useless for a top. But overall, I don't think that wild grain enhances the structural stability or sound of an instrument. John Chamberlain in Richmond, Virginia. George, you gave some good insights on Japanese-made guitars, and I would like to ask for your opinion regarding the quality of Chinese-made instruments. Do you think companies like Gibson Breedlove will continue to have their lower price points, Epiphone, as an example, produced in China, given the trade issues the US has had with China, as well as the fallout from the coronavirus pandemic? The quality of Chinese-made guitars has gone up tremendously in the past decade. It used to be, back in the 1960s, Japanese-made instruments were very inferior to most American-made, but by the mid-70s, the cost of making a guitar in Japan was fully as much as the cost of making one in the USA, and the quality of Japanese guitars really went up tremendously. Well, the Chinese have in some ways followed a similar path. There are Chinese violins now that are absolutely superb instruments. Also, China is a big place with 1.4 some odd billion people. They're not all equally skilled. Not all Chinese manufacturers are equal. I have recently received some Chinese-made gypsy jazz style guitars and classical guitars, which I think are very fine quality and definitely are at par with some European and American made instruments, such that I don't think you can lump all Chinese quality as being one and the same. So Altamira brand gypsy jazz style guitars and some of their classical guitars impress me as being of quality that I'm happy to have. And there are other makers as well. Eastman, for example, has made guitars over a period of years, and their early ones were pretty good, and their newer ones are better yet. We'll have to just say that they're not all created equal. I expect Chinese-made instruments to continue to evolve, and there is every reason to expect that over time, the Chinese instruments, at least from the better makers, will be quite good. And that's like asking, are all American guitars of the same quality? And the answer is absolutely not. So makers cannot be judged simply on origin. Each maker is a maker, a manufacturer unto himself or itself as a company. We don't judge them all as being equal. Mike Todd asked, I would like to know the meaning of a 5-digit ink stamped number, no letters on the actual inside or the back side of the top, not inside of the back. And he commented this was on a 1968 Gibson Hummingbird. In our experience, Gibson didn't put numbers like that inside, so I don't know what the number means, nor do I know who put that number in there. It may be a previous owner who thought he'd put an identification number in an inconspicuous place in case he ever needed to prove it was his, but I can't tell you what that number means, other than that is not a typical Gibson feature. Richard Holler, Martinsville, Indiana. Do you have any knowledge or experience with the Morgan Monroe brand F bass? It's a bass guitar that features and body of an F-style mandolin. I finally found one on eBay that its owner was willing to let go for just a few $100s, so I grabbed it. And to be honest, it plays and sounds horrible, but I'm still pleased with it. I'm not a collector, just a bass player, and I didn't buy it for collector's appeal, but rather just to have conversation starter. And he further comments that it's rare. Well, rarity doesn't necessarily mean it's good. And it is an Asian import. The fact that it's rare probably means that it's a model that didn't go over very well. But at any rate, that's one where rarity doesn't make it valuable. And if it doesn't play well and doesn't sound good and is a good wall hanger, so be it. But Morgan Monroe brand instruments in general are good utility tools, and they're an honest value for what they charge, but they're not particularly expensive. Ron Garrett says, it's my understanding that in the early 1950s, Martin made changes / improvements to the D18. Can you discuss those changes, and was the result a better guitar? Well, what I'd have to say is there wasn't much in the way of changes in the D18 from the late 40s through the early 1950s, but they didn't do anything that would make it a better guitar. The 1930s D18 was, in my opinion, the ultimate D18 with Adirondack spruce top with scalloped forward shifted X bracing from 34 through late 38, ebony fingerboard and bridge. By the 50s, they had the same style steel non-adjustable T-bar in the neck that they had in the 30s, but they had a Sitka spruce top with non-scalloped rear shifted bracing, Rosewood fingerboard and bridge. And in my opinion, there was nothing done in the early 50s that was an improvement over what had been before. The brand new D18s made today actually have neck specifications more similar to the pre-war, but the new ones have an adjustable rod, which the 50s don't have. And the brand new D18 is actually a very good guitar. The 50s D18s are good, but they're not better than the 30s. And the new D18 has better intonation and has an adjustable rod and has neck dimensions that I actually like better than the 50s. And some of the custom shop Martins made now are really superb. Similar thing, Randall Presley in Iowa, I have heard that the overall quality of 1970s era Martin guitars was not as desirable as other years. What factors were present in the 70s that may have impacted their quality? Well, starting in beginning of 69, Martin put in great big rosewood bridge plates, whereas before they'd used smaller maple bridge plates. That was something that definitely dampened the sound in the 69 and into the 70s. The 70s guitars don't have as accurate intonation. Martin had a theory that you needed to put the spacing from the nut to the saddle and then take that same spacing, where normally would be where the bridge saddle would go, but increase it a little bit to supposedly compensate for the pressure of pushing down on the string, which would sharp the note. Well, they overcompensated, and the 70s ones don't intonate as well. The 70s ones also do not have the steel T-bar in the neck. They have a hollow square tube that goes in the neck, non-adjustable, and it's actually not as strong as the T-bar that they used in the period from 1934 right on up through about 1968. So the 70s guitars, in my opinion, are not as desirable. The neck contours were not as desirable, and they typically were set up with very high action with the idea that the dealer could adjust it wherever people wanted it. So in general, I think of the 1970s as being some of the worst Martins made, but the worst Martins made were still pretty good guitars. They're not junk, and with good setup work, they still can be set up to play quite well. Wayne asks, do you have any thoughts on the new distressed guitars? Almost all of the distressed guitars from companies like Gibson, Martin, or Fender are their higher quality guitars, but distressed in general, there are Chinese-made guitars and Korean-made guitars, and now even some relatively inexpensive American ones that have distressed finishes to look old and funky, much the way distressed blue jeans may look. And I personally have never understood the appeal of wearing blue jeans with holes in them and worn out, but most of my career, I've been looking for vintage instruments in which the better the quality was of condition, the more money they would bring. And if you had one that was beat up, it was considered, gee, that's too bad, but we can sell it for a lower price. And if it's one that had been modified, like taking a Fender guitar and putting humbucking Gibson pickup in the bridge position, well, it might sound good, but it would be, that was a real shame. But now people pay extra for custom shop guitars, whereas you can get, with Fender, you can get the new old stock model, vintage reissue that looks like a brand new factory, straight out of the factory, but old one. And you get the closet classic that has a little bit of wear on it, fake wear, that costs more. And then the distressed model that costs more yet. And you can get a special custom shop one that really looked like it's beat to heck, and they charge more for that. I think if you want one that is rough and you play hard and you beat them up, you could buy the new old stock model and you could beat it up yourself rather than paying them to charge a lot more to beat it up for you. You could do it yourself, but I have a somewhat bemused attitude toward it. But I can say that some of the new distressed custom shop instruments from these various makers are very good guitars. And for example, Martin does do distressed model authentic series guitars that are fine guitars. But I personally would just as soon have the same quality guitar not beat up. But that, again, is a matter of personal preference. How do you, from John, how do you go about attaching a certain value to an instrument that was owned by a notable celebrity versus the same instrument that was not? Well, the fact is, celebrity-owned instruments do not automatically have a certain multiplier factor that you can apply. A guitar owned by Johnny Cash would be worth more than one owned by Joe Blow, but it also depends how much did John use it. Did he just own it, or did he actually use it? John had at least about 100 guitars, and some he used a lot, some he used on stage, some he used only a bit at home to strum on or on the bus. Some he recorded with, some were in videos. The ones that are the most notable certainly will bring a lot of money. And in his case, some of them have brought well over $100,000 for instruments that might otherwise have been worth $1,200. And obviously their guitars, Jerry Garcia's several of his guitars have brought almost $1 million. Jimi Hendrix Stratocaster used at Woodstock would bring a heck of a lot of money, whereas it wouldn't be worth near as much if it were a similar one owned by Joe Blow. But how do you rate the value of Jimi Hendrix versus Peter Frampton or Eric Clapton? This is a very, very subjective situation, in addition to which we can say that some players are famous during their lifetime, but it may not translate to 20 years later. So Conway Twitty's Gretsch guitar brought $25,000 at auction very shortly after he died. I'm not quite sure that it would bring as much today. And then the Liberace Museum in Las Vegas closed because Liberace's fans were sufficiently geriatric that most of them at this point would either be very geriatric or already dead. But memorabilia is a very, very subjective market. There is no straight answer to what multiplier factor you can put in. Thomas, when is a Fender no longer a Fender? Recently, I saw a listing for an early 60s Tele that had an early 70s neck. The body had a pro refinish and had been routed at one time for humbucking pickup. It seems that Leo had intended these to have easily replaced necks and parts. So how far can you go and still call it a Fender? Well, the fact is we see quite a few guitars that, rather than calling it a Telecaster or a Stratocaster, I tend to call them a Partocaster. And some of them will have a few Fender parts and mostly aftermarket parts. And you can get boogie bodies or Warmoth bodies or some homemade body, and you can get interchangeable parts where a guitar might have all Fender parts, except that it might be put together from numerous other guitars. Even Clapton's Blackie was assembled from parts of several of guitars that he really liked, the neck of this one and the body of that one and the pickups from this other one. So in Eric's case, it was his guitar, and that guitar sold at auction for, I believe, $985,000. But it wouldn't have brought much had it been from somebody else. And in fact, in 1970, Eric played with Derek and the Dominoes for the Johnny Cash TV show, which was right around the corner from my shop at the time. And he bought 4 Stratocasters from me and then went around the corner to Showbud and bought necks, bodies, pickups, and parts to make a few more. And Blackie appears to be made from some of that. And I didn't charge him more than $400 for any of those guitars at that time. But that was 1970, 50 years ago. But when is it no longer a Fender? I don't have the right answer, except I can give the analogy of a family heirloom that has been handed down from generation to generation. We treasure it greatly, Abraham Lincoln's axe. But we've used it over the years, so we really did have to replace the head twice and the handle 3 times, but we treasure Abe's axe and we never, ever, ever get rid of it. I did have a question from just curious as to how many pet snakes do I have in my office? That's from Steve. Well, here's one of them. This is a ball python that was a little baby fellow when I got him, and he's not quite adult size now, but there he is. You can wear him almost like a clothing accessory. There's 20 snakes in my office right now, and I've got ball pythons, I've got Australian carpet pythons, I've got Central Australian Breedl's python, I've got Cuban boas. In fact, I'm not quite sure how many Cuban boas I've got. I've got a big female, and I recently got her a boyfriend, and they have been very much in love lately. And I'm not quite sure how many babies are due to arrive, but being a big mama, she may be bringing as many as 25 more on the way. But I'm hoping to see how many snakes I have later this year. But for a while, I may just keep my little accessory here, and we'll see. You can see how content he is hanging out with me. So anyway, Jim, I am not a collector. I only buy guitars I want to play. And when I found I wasn't playing guitars, I sold them even though highly collectible. I've talked to Richard Hoover and James Goodall about building guitars to my specs, but hesitated because what if when it was built, the guitar didn't like me? Or I like it, perhaps. Similarly, I haven't been able to purchase online because I feel I have to play a guitar to know whether it really fits me. Am I wacky or what? Well, A, no, it's not wacky to want to play a guitar before you play it. If you're a musician who's buying a guitar strictly based on feel and sound, which is a darn good reason to pick one if you're going to make a living playing it, or if you're an amateur and you're, again, buying it for the pleasure of playing, it should feel and sound the way you like. And if you order a custom guitar, it may or may not do that. You can certainly order the ornamentation you like. You can order the type of wood you think you would like. You can order the neck dimensions you would like, but it's always something of a gamble to know exactly what it's going to sound like. You can shop and find a dozen Martin guitars, new or same model used ones, and play a dozen of them, and you can find that they don't all sound identical. No two pieces of wood sound quite the same, and sometimes it seems a bit of a mystery as to why one sounds better than another. But the fact is, they're not all created equal. I personally tend to like vintage guitars, but I also have new guitars that I like very much. But if I order a run of custom guitars made to my specs, I can play a dozen of them, and I'll find that one or two may speak to me more than the others do, although another person may play the same group of a dozen and a different one speaks to him. No two people have quite the same touch, and that is critically important. So ordering custom guitars, one of a kind, strictly to your specs may be a gamble as to how much you're going to like it. But certainly, if you have a maker with a great reputation, the chance that it's going to be a really, really superb guitar are greatly enhanced. And makers are not all created equal. If you order a new Monteleone archtop guitar, I'm sure it's going to be a good guitar. He has an impeccable reputation and it's well deserved. On the other hand, his starting price to build anything is $50,000 plus. If you're looking to have bang for the buck, you may be better off to play a bunch of guitars that are already made and pick the one that speaks to you. That's at least my general advice. Anyway, it's a further question here. The same person is asking Bourgeois, Santa Cruz, and Collings will likely be future collectibles. What lesser known vintage ones, lesser known made today would likely be vintage collectible in the future? In general, I think that it's very difficult to give a straight answer to that. The ones that are likely to be collectible in the future are relatively well known today. And there are certainly other builders, such as Kim Walker up in Connecticut, great builder. He does very, very low production, but they're great instruments. And anything that, if it plays well and sounds good, it's likely to be a maker who has a decent amount of experience. Wayne Henderson, Don Wilson, who also works, a good friend of Wayne, and Cunningham, also another friend of Wayne in that same area. They build fine instruments. There are more good custom luthiers today than probably ever before in the history of the instrument. It's hard to say which ones will be collectible 50 years from now, and or even 20 years from now. The fact is that depends also on what the quality of standard factory models is at that time. We don't know the answer yet. Greg Stearns, how did Neil Young acquire Hank Williams' guitar? Neil has a herringbone D28 that he says was Hank's. Documentation is critically important. If you don't have documentation to indisputably prove that an instrument belonged to a specific artist, it is likely to be really difficult to resell it at a high price as memorabilia. Hank Williams Jr. has his daddy's D28. He's not about to sell it. And he doesn't claim to know of any others that daddy owned that are out there. There's a D18 that belonged to Hank that is at the Martin factory that they purchased. And as I said, Hank has daddy's guitar. And unless Neil can come up with indisputable documentation proving that that was Hank's guitar, I'll not say more on that subject. His same next question from the same person: was Hank Williams Jr. a guitar collector? Did he help you start your business? The answer is yes, he was a guitar collector. And he happens to be a very sophisticated, knowledgeable collector, particularly also of antique firearms and Civil War memorabilia. It would be a great mistake to underestimate his intellect. He may have lived wild and crazy, but Hank is one smart dude. And in 1968, I did get a call from Hank Jr. when I was a graduate student at UT Knoxville, asking me what I had in the way of guitars. I talked to him about it for a couple of minutes, and he said I could be there in 4 hours. Well, he was in Nashville and I was in Knoxville, and in 68, there was no interstate highway, but he did come in 4 hours driving a Jaguar E, which doesn't hold much. But he did bring one guitar to trade. He picked up 3 guitars from me, which is all that car would haul, and came back the next day in a Cadillac Eldorado because it would haul more. And he told me that Nashville didn't have anybody like me. And if I wanted to start a store, he'd have a place waiting for me. And I did take him up on that offer later, a few months later. And he had an apartment waiting for me. He and I never did go into business together. Sometimes you find that the best way to remain friends with somebody is to not go into business and not borrow or loan to them. And in this case, we're better off that way. But Hank did have a role in getting me to come to Nashville. Same person asks, was Norman Blake's 1934 12 fret D28 supposedly the only one made that year? How did he acquire it? Was he your partner? And no, Norman Blake was not my partner, but in 1970, we did offer him space in the store as a small studio room to teach guitar, which he did for a few months until he got enough studio work that he didn't need to do that anymore. His 12 fret D28, which he no longer has, was the only known sunburst finish 12 fret D28, but would not be the only 1934 12 fret D28, but it would be the only known in sunburst finish, but the finish was in poor condition, and a good bit of the finish on the top wasn't even original. It had a large pick guard that had been removed, and quite a bit of refinish, poor touch-up work was done on the top. But that guitar had recently been offered for a very high price by not by Norman, and it did not sell. But Wayne Rakoff, you said you don't like Torrefied tops. Why did you put one on the Pattingale Special? The Pattingale Special was a model that took actually at least 2 years of back and forth conversations between Pattingale, me, and Martin, so far as ever getting the specs done in an acceptable manner. It was a very difficult project to get all parties on the same page. Martin had Torrefied Adirondack that did not pass their standards for grain pattern to be used on a custom shop or authentic series guitar. And Pattingale wanted originally to have a guitar that sounded much like his single-O size Martin with a mahogany top. And what we settled on was the Torrefied Adirondack with dark stain mahogany color, which actually gives a sound remarkably like his mahogany top Martin. So that does say why we did that. But it still comes down to, do I think that Torrefied Adirondack sounds like naturally aged Adirondack? My answer still is no. Don Bryan asks, which was the most legendary instrument you either owned, repaired, or sold? Well, we've had some very famous guitars that have gone through here. Not long ago, a few months ago, we sold the Mission Control Grateful Dead alembic bass. That was a certainly highest price I know of ever that we've ever gotten, or that anybody else I know of has ever gotten for an electric bass. But that was a very special instrument. In Martin guitars, we had the Martin D45 that had been owned by Red Smiley, but we had that back in 1974 and sold that. So that was a very famous guitar. We also had on consignment and sold, and is now in the Country Music Hall of Fame, Maybelle Carter's L5 Gibson guitar, which is one of the most famous guitars in the history of country music. We've sold instruments that might not have been famous at the time they were sold, but became so. For example, I previously mentioned in today's conversation about Eric Clapton's guitar, Blackie. We sold Rick Derringer a forked head Explorer back in the early 70s. We sold Eric Clapton an Explorer back in the early 70s. So Eric Clapton's bought quite a few guitars from us, but for that matter, so have a lot of other well-known performers. And some of those instruments might not have been memorabilia the day before I sold them, but they were memorabilia right after I sold them. So that happens. Tom Van Tilburg. I have a 1995 Gibson L4. Is it best for me to keep it in its case in between the times I play it a day or two, or can I hang it on a stand as long as the humidity in the room is not too dry? When it's in the case, I do monitor the humidity and keep it around 50%. Well, if the room is at the right humidity, there's no reason why it has to be in its case. Unless you have small children or pets running around, it may knock it over or scratch it or whatever. It may be safer in its case. But as long as it is at the right humidity and at a sensible temperature, which means usually above 45 and generally not more than about 80 for storage, it should be fine. Guitars are comfortable in the same temperature and humidity that people are. And sometimes people even wonder, if you hang it on the wall, is that going to put stress on the neck? And the answer is, the guitar doesn't weigh all that much. The stress of hanging it on from a wall mount is not great. That shouldn't hurt it, as long as you don't have a mounting that will damage the finish on the instrument. You don't want lacquer finishes to be in contact with vinyl. That reacts badly. And some rubberized mountings also are not good. So some guitar stands and mounting arrangements are just poorly designed and may damage the finish. So that's something to watch out for. Wade Rollins. The early documentation showed Gibson Rosewood Southern Jumbos with the factory work order number 910, but other factory work order numbers associated with Rosewood Southern Jumbos have since turned up. Do you have a sense of how many factory work order batches of these early Rosewood SJs were produced at this point? It appears that in 1942, there were work order batches 8074 and 8075. And in 43, there were work order batches 910 and 2005. And those four batches, which very likely had as many as 40 instruments per batch, did have Rosewood back and sides on SJ model Gibsons. So that is info that we believe is accurate and up to date to the best knowledge available today. Bill, occasionally Gruhn Guitars lists an acoustic archtop or flat top as having exceptionally fine tone or some other superlative indicating the instrument possesses superior tone or playability. Are you, Mr. Gruhn, the sole judge of this, or may staff experts also make this judgment? And how is such an assessment made? By listening to one's own playing, sitting in front of and listening to another player, or both? In general, that is my personal assessment. However, if a staff member also feels that way or just brings one to me, I am quite open to listening to him play it as well as me play it. And I agree there is a subjectivity to it. But I'd like to think that after well over 50 years, about 57 and a half years of playing and collecting, I have a pretty good notion of what they sound like. And I can generally tell by playing it how it will sound when somebody else plays it as well. But at any rate, we do listen to these things with me playing them, and also typically hearing somebody else play it on staff as well. And since I am involved with the descriptions, it is generally, when it is that listing, it is my personal call. The same person says, I do my best to maintain relatively safe zone of temperature and humidity, but do not use individual in-case humidifiers, although I know I should. Well, frankly, I think a room humidifier or a whole house humidifier is best of all. But what do you recommend regarding string tension with respect to stored acoustic guitars? If they're going to be stored and not played for extended periods of time, months at a time, I feel that it is best to slack the strings. One, there's a lot of tension on an acoustic instrument, and even a significant amount on an electric. If it's not going to be used for months on end and kept in the case, you're likely to find that eventually the neck may warp, and the less tension you have on it, the better, if you're not going to be playing it. The other thing is, if you're not going to be looking at it for months on end or even a year, there's too many horror stories of I put it in the case, it was fully in tune. I didn't open the case for 2 years, but when I finally did, the bridge had pulled off and pulled a chunk of wood with it. If you're not going to be looking at it on a regular basis, you're likely to find that things can go wrong. And if you don't look at it often enough, it's a whole lot safer to leave that instrument with strings slack than at full tension of an acoustic, which with medium gauge strings can have as much as 150 pounds of tension. So if anything goes wrong, glue seam comes loose, whatever, unattended, that can really do bad things. Also, even bindings, nitrocellulose can deteriorate. And if you haven't looked at it in a long time, a pick guard that's shrinking a bit can cause the top to crack. And if you haven't looked at it in a long time, bad things can happen. It's good to have them where at least you see them periodically. And if you're not going to look at it for a long time, put it at the right temperature, the right humidity, and slack those strings. Eric in Atlanta, can you tell us if there was a guitar that was the one that got away that still haunts you from time to time? Sometimes the one that got away is one you used to have and you sold when you didn't later. You realize, oh, I wish I'd kept it. And I can think of plenty like that. I had a Lore F5 that I sold when I probably should have kept it, personal one, but I had a Lore signed L5 that was the 4th guitar I ever owned. And times were rough in 1981 when prime rate interest was 20%, and I sold it because I needed to pay taxes and stuff. I wish I had it back. There's a few instruments, like the guy came in back, this is at least 30 years ago. He had an original 5-string flathead Gibson Granada banjo, and I negotiated with him for half the day, and he left. And then he called me up and said that he'd be on his way. He was going to bring it in. He agreed to take my price, and he never showed. And that's haunted me ever since. There's been a few that I wish I'd bought that on retrospect, you know, They asked a little more than I thought I wanted to pay. I remember an early 1850s Martin with pearl trim that back in the period of, this was back in the late 1970s, I asked him how much he wanted and he wouldn't say. And I just finally got to the point, I said, well, if you won't tell me what you want, he said, well, just make me an offer. And I just said, yeah, it's useless. If you don't tell me what you want, it won't happen. And I found out later he sold it for $400 and I probably would have been willing to pay $1,000. So that was an example of something I should have done. Marshall Cohen, longtime customer. I live up north and grapple with a dry house. I've been buying a huge room humidifier. Do you have a preference when it comes to case or sound hole humidifier brands or devices? Frankly, I'm not greatly enamored of any of the case or sound hole devices. They don't humidify the whole instrument. They may humidify the body, but if it's an in-sound hole, it does nothing for the humidity of the neck. The best thing to do is humidify the room or the house. What we use in our shop is a Nortec brand humidification system, 1 unit per floor. And the other thing I can say is if you get a humidifier installed onto your home central heat system, not only will it help your instruments, but it'll help you. Your skin will feel better and your throat won't always feel dry and crackly, and you'll be less likely to get the flu or colds, or in these days of COVID-19, you probably even have better resistance to getting the coronavirus if you have a home humidifier. So guitars like the same humidified humidity that we do. The ideal environment for a guitar is exactly the same temperature and humidity that feels good to a human. Therefore, humidify your room, or better yet, your home. So, also Eric in Atlanta had asked, what is your opinion of the pre-custom shop Fullerton 57 and 62 reissues from 1982 through 85 that I hear were the first reissue ever Strats made by Fender that led to the creation of the Fender custom shop? I'm familiar with those. I remember when they were new, and they were good guitars, but not as good as the pre-CBS originals. And in my opinion, not as good as what Fender does in the custom shop today. These will bring more money than a later vintage series reissue of the regular vintage series rather than custom shop. But again, they're important in Fender's history, and it got them back into doing vintage style guitars. But a good bit of what got Fender into doing that was companies like Tokai in Japan were already making very good replicas. They didn't say Fender on them, but they were extraordinarily close copies. In fact, the earliest reissue catalog that Fender has, or that had, it's a rather interesting note if you look at the picture showing the front and back view of the vintage reissue new model in that catalog and look close. It's a very well done photo. In fact, it's sufficiently fine detail that you can read the name on the back of the tuning gears on the guitar, and it says Tokai. So that is something that was a big oops that Fender didn't catch when they issued that catalog. But I would say that Tokai may well be one of the factors that inspired Fender to start making vintage replica guitars. John Willingham. I have a 1961 D18, a beloved heirloom. It's a great sounding Martin, however, it's kind of hard to play. It does not have a truss rod, so setting the neck angle is not an option. I have had the neck reset once and that helped, but the action still increases as you go up the neck. Do you have any recommendations? Well, I have a number of comments. One, his guitar does have a rod in the neck, it just doesn't happen to be adjustable. But if it's a 1961, it has a tempered steel T-bar in the neck. Two, setting the neck angle is not an option. That's not true. You can take the neck out, you can reset it. He said he had it reset once. I don't know what he means by that, but if a reset involves taking the neck out and you do change the angle, and it can be set where the action is comfortable up and down the neck. On the other hand, he says, but the action still increases as you go up the neck. Well, of course it does. If you had the neck angle such that the action was exactly the same at the 12th fret as it is at the 1st fret, it would buzz. It does require to feel right having action higher at the 12th fret than at the 1st fret. But again, if the neck was not set properly when he had it reset, it may result in still having poor action as you go up the neck. But I haven't seen his guitar, but at any rate, that is what I can offer in the way of comments. We have from Terry Gann in Tucson, Arizona. I have a Martin 1952 D28, which you appraised a few years ago. I would like to install a K&K pickup. Will this have any negative effects on the value of the guitar? If the guitar is absolutely pristine, brand new looking, which very, very few are, putting an end pin jack would require drilling out that hole and putting in a different jack. That could reduce value a bit on something that's totally, completely pristine. But in general, if you have one that has a bit of wear, putting a K&K pickup on the underside of the top is not going to hurt the instrument. It's not going to, in any significant way, change the value of that instrument, but it's not going to increase the value either. But if it makes it more usable for you, it's a guitar that suits what you do. If the job is done right, then I see no reason to not do this. Aaron has a couple of questions. One, what is one thing you wish you had known when you first started to collect guitars? Well, I didn't know that much when I started. So I'd have to say that one thing, there were no books available at the time. I wish there were good reference guides. I wish I'd even had as much as a Martin serial number list, but Martin didn't publish one yet. There was so little knowledge, it's almost impossible for me to give just one factor. But the thing that I found the most helpful was finding people who could mentor me, who knew more than I did, and just making the right contacts. Because today you can buy books, you can buy videos. There are lots of dealers who are knowledgeable, who will provide a goodly bit of information. But in the early days, there was far less of that. Same person is asking, what years do you consider the best for Martin, Taylor, Gibson as far as production quality? And that's actually stuff I've talked about before. I think the best Taylor guitars are the ones made right now. But Taylor only started in 1974, and Bob and others with the company have learned a lot. And Andy Powers, who Bob has put in as his chief designer, is, in Bob's own words, a better designer than he himself is. So Bob will tell you that the best Taylors ever made are the ones made right now. I'm in full agreement. They're good guitars. To me, the best Martins ever for gut string guitars would be from the 1840s on through the rest of the life of C.F. Martin Sr. But basically the guitars made prior to no later than 1867, that period of the 1840s right on up to about 1867. Those are the best gut string Martins ever made. The best steel string guitars Martin ever made, in my opinion, are from 1929 through late 1938. But the best Martin guitars made in the past 60 years, I'd say, are being made right now. They are very good guitars, and they come close to rivaling some of the true golden era guitars, especially for the custom shop models. They are fine instruments. Same person who is one artist that many people don't know about but should, and I'll say that my favorite acoustic guitar player of all time might well be Norman Blake. And there's quite a few good recordings of him. He's still alive. He's in his early 80s. He's a wonderful person and a great player. Richard Wells, of all the new builders of resonator guitars these days, which ones today rate the highest in your opinion? I think Shearhorn made great ones, but he's pretty well retired at this point. And the National Resophonic Company still does Shearhorn design resonator guitars, but he's not personally doing them. Paul Beard, in my opinion, is the one. If I have to pick one current maker of resonator guitars, he's the one. But if you want to have a metal body resonator guitar for that kind of blues playing, then National Resophonic would be the one. So Beard doesn't do metal body guitars, he does wood body guitars. So I'll say National Resophonic makes the best metal body ones and Beard makes the best wood body ones. Brian, I can't pronounce his last name, but anyway, sales manager at the Music Den in New Jersey. I've been to 2 of your shops in the past. Do you miss your old locations? Are you happy with the current store? Would you do anything differently? With this new normal moving forward, do you think your business model will change? And what, if any, are your plans? Well, I'm in my 4th location. The first one was 1,200 square feet. The rent was $125 a month and later went up to $150. The roof leaked. You could hardly heat it. You could hardly cool it. There were termites in the wood construction of the building that only liked damp wood, so they didn't bother the instruments, but they did swarm each spring. And I'm pleased to have moved out of it. I bought a building at 410 Broadway after that, was in that from 1975, actually from 76 through mid 93. And we outgrew that building and it was somewhat funky. But it had 6,500 square feet on 3 floors. We then got into 400 Broadway at 12,500 square feet on a small parking lot in the rear. But then the neighborhood changed and they changed the sound control ordinances where you could blast sound out at any volume you wanted. You could have windows open like garage doors and blasted it out. The crowds got worse and worse. And it was impossible to do business there. And I bought the building we're in now. And when asked about how much do I miss the old building, as much as I'd miss a thorn that had just been pulled out of my foot, how soon did it take to feel better? As soon as I saw that building in the rear view mirror for the last time leaving it. Would I do things differently? Yeah, I would not have sold the parking lot behind the old building. I would have sold the building and kept the parking lot, which today would be worth a heck of a lot of money. But I don't miss the neighborhood and I don't want to go back. How will things change with the coronavirus pandemic and what it does to the economy? Well, I'd say that a lot of that remains to be seen. But right now, we are operating, doing mail order, telephone, and we're packing and shipping, and we're doing online business. How soon will we open the showroom? How soon will things ever be normal again? Will they ever be the same as before? Answer, I don't know. But have I ever faced anything as difficult as this? The answer is 1981 was every bit as hard, and we recovered. But it took years. 2008 was hard, but not as hard as what we're going through, I think, right now, so far as the world economy. We'll see. But Richard Craig, what is your opinion of some guitar makers' use of modern techniques or technology, torrefication, HPL, etc., to try to replicate some of the qualities of older instruments for less expense? Can structure and workmanship help make up for the scarcity of higher quality materials? Great design can, to a large extent, take some of the sting out of the lack of some of the best old Brazilian rosewood and air-seasoned wood that's been aged for 20 plus years. But the fact is, design is first and foremost. Structural workmanship is next. Quality materials is next. And there still are quality materials available. Human hands still have the same brain power behind them as we had in the past. People aren't all of a sudden stupid. And there are still good instruments made, but it's hard to make the sound of a really great guitar and do it cheaply. But the fact is, bang for buck, a lot of new guitars today are remarkably good value. And many of the makers today are using better quality designs than they were doing back in the 60s and 70s. So there are new guitars that are good. Paul Alcantara, my special interest in pre-war Gibson archtop guitars focused on 16-inch L5s over the years. I've seen a number of examples that were returned to Kalamazoo shortly after purchase to be refinished or even fitted with a new neck. Question, if a guitar was originally shipped, say in 1933, was refinished at the factory a year or two later, to what extent would that impact its value today? Well, if it was refinished a year or two later, one question is, why would they do that? It wouldn't make a tremendous difference. It might be hard to tell if it was refinished a year or two later, but if it was one made, say, prior to 1929, and it was refinished in the 30s finishes were different color, different texture. They really didn't sound the same, and they were doing lacquer rather than varnish, and that would be less. And the dimensions of the necks in the 30s were also quite different from the 20s. In general, something that is pristine original will bring more money and is more desirable. Alex asks, as a collector prioritizing value over price, and as a player looking for daily joy of bonding with an amazing instrument, which 3 guitars, 2 electric, 1 acoustic flat top, would you seek to acquire in the next year? Well, that depends on the price bracket that you're in, but I would say that if you can get, to me personally, I like Martin guitars made from 34 through 38 if you want a steel string guitar. There's a wide variety. And then it's a matter of what style of music are you going to play. If you want to play finger picking or blues, you might get something like a Martin 000. And if you want to get maximum bang for the buck, a good 0018 from 34 through 38 is a fantastic guitar. And a D18 at that same age is also phenomenal, except the D18 will cost a lot more. And so far as electrics, to me, you know, it's hard to beat a good old Blackguard Telly, 50s Tellys, but particularly the early Blackguard ones 51 through mid 54 are phenomenal, but any 50s tellies are great. And I really would like to have, if I'm playing electric and want two guitars, I'd want to have a solid body Gibson, like a Les Paul. If you can afford a Les Paul Standard, great. If you can't afford a Les Paul Standard, even something like, even an old Les Paul Junior from the 50s is a great guitar. They may not have a lot of features, like a Junior will have one volume and one tone and one pickup, but it's a good pickup and it's a great neck and it's a fine guitar. And I'd want a semi-hollow guitar and a solid body. So I'd probably want a Les Paul and an ES335, and I'd get the best ES335s or before no later than mid-1965. I'd want a 335 that has the stop tailpiece and a tunematic bridge, an early one. James asks, are there any archtop guitar brands that you consider sleepers in terms of collectability? And I think that the early New York-made Epiphone archtops are really underrated. They bring much less money than the same age Gibson, and they are very fine guitars, and they deserve attention. And bang for buck, they're great instruments. Richie Perkins, can you share a little about the most difficult restoration that's been done at Gruhn Guitars? Well, there's been plenty of difficult ones. We've been in business over 50 years, but we had a 1959 Les Paul Sunburst that was in a car accident and the neck was just shattered, and it looked like almost anybody would want to put a new neck on it. And one of my men spent over 3 months working on it, put everything back together where with a magnifying glass, you couldn't tell that anything had happened. And it played great. And the only problem for that, as far as I'm concerned, is we weren't able to buy it. We fixed it for the owner, but we didn't end up having it. But it was a phenomenal job. And but we've done lots and lots of repair jobs that literally, you can't resurrect living animals or people from the dead, but you can take guitars and pretty well take things that look like they are indeed dead. And if you spend enough time and you have enough skill, we have some people upstairs who are almost like the story of the little princess, or the one who became a princess, Rumpelstiltskin, spinning the straw into gold. Well, we have some guys upstairs who just about do that. It's time consuming, it's expensive, but if it's the right instrument, it's worth the effort to do so. Dom Nelson, if you could own any guitar previously owned by a guitarist, whose guitar would it be and which one? What's your favorite guitar you own, and who, if anybody, has left you the most starstruck? Well, I don't get starstruck very much. That's not to say that I'm not impressed. Like Norman Blake is one of my favorite guitar players ever. Vince Gill is a great close friend, and I'm also incredibly impressed with him as a person and as a player. Am I gaga starstruck? No, but I feel very privileged to have him as a friend. What's the favorite guitar you own? There's so many different kinds of guitars. I've said before, I have one wife, but for guitars, I prefer a harem. But my 1929 L5 that's just like Maybelle Carter's guitar is one of my absolute favorites. And the 1934 Good Martin 000 is also something. 0045 from that year, to me, is a wonderful, wonderful instrument. And I could do real well with just those two and nothing else. Some new questions. Jim Anderson, can you talk a bit about the Fender colors of the 1950s and how much a premium they bring over 60s custom colors. Well, in general, the 50s guitars had fewer custom options than in the 60s. But the fact is 50s Fenders typically bring more money than 60s guitars. And if you have a burgundy mist Fender 60s guitar, for the right Stratocaster, there are people who pay a big premium over what it would be if it was a standard Sunburst. So percentage-wise, does a 60s custom color add as much as a 50s custom color? The answer is yes, it does. But does the 60s guitar start out bringing as much money as the same model from the 50s? Typically, no. So, but the custom color option, percentage-wise, adds every bit as much value. Morty Mir, hello, same question as last week. Have you ever heard of vintage Jacobacci guitars from France? Seems the American market doesn't take notice, but you guys are buying Hoff, Vox, etc., which are really not that good. Well, yeah, the Vox guitars that are not all that good, in some cases happen to be the same models that the Rolling Stones played, and therefore there are memorabilia players, collectors who want one like that. Do I think the Vox guitars are wonderful? No. Do I think old Hofner Beatle basses are wonderful? No. But there are people who pay a lot of money. Jacobacci, actually, I've met him back in the 70s. He and his friend André Duchessois from Paris visited Nashville, and that was in the very early 70s. And he was a good builder, but I've never had one of his guitars. Never been offered one here, and I'm not even sure exactly what those would bring at this point, but he was a competent builder. But have I had people asking for one? No, I haven't. The French guitars that people ask for the most are original Selmer gypsy jazz guitars, and there are a few makers of classical guitars such as Boucher, those who bring a lot of money. But there are only a few French guitar makers that typically would bring a lot of money. Cole Stant, in your opinion, is it worth a musician holding onto a guitar just because they like it, even if its design and performance don't match up with that player's style? Well, if it doesn't match up with with the player's style, why do they like it? If they're holding onto it because they like it, they must have some reason they like it. And if they like it, keep it. But if they like it enough to actually use it, then something tells me it must actually suit their style somehow. Daryl Wolf, who I've known for many years, asks, what might we expect this economic crisis to do to high-end vintage instruments? Well, for one thing, that's a multifaceted question, because what does it do right now? Well, a lot of musicians right now have no paying gigs, so they're probably not buying as much right now unless it's somebody who's already made millions and doesn't have to worry about that. But what's it going to do in the short run? Well, anytime there's a recession or a depression, it's likely to have a negative impact on market prices, at least temporarily. But the high-end vintage instruments, the ones that have stood the test of time, are the same ones that people wanted 50 years ago. they're what they wanted 40 years ago, 30 years ago, they want now, and they'll probably still want later. Stradivari violins are still valuable. But during an economic depression, prices can go down. But ultimately, the cream of the crop still rises. And do I think that the vintage instruments will still be in demand in the future as long as there's music that people would utilize these instruments for? Yes. Look at the violin market. Stradivari died in 1737. There's been lots of ups and downs in that market, but people still want those instruments. And vintage instruments, if they're well cared for, can last a long time. As for example, people are still playing some violins made in the 1500s. They've had restoration work over the years, but they're still playable. And we still see instruments that are over 100 years old that are in almost pristine condition if they've been well cared for, that need no work at all. A new set of strings. So that should tell me that these instruments are going to keep their value. So we've pretty well filled up our time allotment, and almost every question, actually. There's just only a couple more, so we can wrap it up and still even get to that. Because Terry White asked, did Gibson ever offer gold as a color standard or custom on the 50s Les Paul Jr.? He says, I have one that looks authentic or a very good refin. I suspect it's a very good refin. I never heard of one that had that color. Paul Andrew, how was Maybell's L5 set up? Was it easy to play? The answer was, it was set up great. It was a wonderful guitar to play. Bob Stroud, did Grammer ever build any lefty models? The answer is yes, but not many. Jason Shepard, I had jumbo frets installed on my Hummingbird and found that my grip sharpens the notes a lot more than when I use a capo. Can I have the frets dressed to the point where they aren't jumbo anymore? Should I just refret again? Frankly, I think you need to take that to a really competent, good repairman and have it examined to see what it's doing. It may be possible to dress it where that won't be a problem, but without examining the guitar in person, I can't give you a straight answer. Kevin DeSand, last question. How do different size frets affect playability? I'm an amateur player and hear about medium and jumbo frets. For an amateur player, the answer is you probably won't notice much difference. On an electric guitar, for bending notes, the size and contour of the frets can make quite a bit of difference. But in general, a wide variety of different type frets, if they're properly dressed, can play very well. I look forward to talking to you again next week and look forward to more good questions. And the more challenging the questions are, the more fun they are for me. So I don't guarantee to have answers to all questions. When I become omniscient, I'll be sure to let everybody know promptly, but I have not achieved either omniscience or omnipotence yet. But the moment I do, you'll all know. Until then, I look forward to seeing and hearing from you again next week.